Diving right in, the French people will return to their polling booth on Sunday and vote in the second runoff of the presidential election, deciding who will run the government for the next 5 years. The choice is between the two final contenders, that is, the incumbent president and centrist leader Emmanuel Macron. Macron is looking to secure a second consecutive term, something that has not happened in the last 2 decades. And the leader of the far-right National Rally, Marine Le Pen, who needs the victory for her political career, because if she loses her third election, then her position as the chief of the National Rally will be at risk. The stakes, as you can see, are quite high. Both candidates have concluded their campaigning, and now it is up to the voters to choose the next president of France. And now in our next report, we will tell you all that you need to know. Take a look.
Incumbent French President Emmanuel Macron and his far-right rival Marine Le Pen were on the offensive as they made their final appeals to the electorate ahead of Sunday's runoff vote. Centrist, pro-European Macron has consistently led the polls against his anti-immigration, Eurosceptic challenger, well outside the margins of error. But with abstention expected to be high, ire towards some of Macron's policies and a dislike of his sometimes abrasive style, his re-election is no done deal. Undecided voters will be weighing their fears of what a Le Pen presidency could bring against their anger towards Macron's record. Macron has acknowledged his failure to soothe some of the frustration and dissatisfaction around his efforts at economic and social reform, which he says Le Pen is using to drive her campaign. But he has urged voters to resist what he called the rise of far-right ideology.
We should not get used to the rise of far-right ideas. I think there are differences in the Democratic in a Republican field which should face each other off in a local or national election, but there are then differences of values between the categories of these ideas.
Le Pen's policies include a ban on Muslim headscarves in public, giving French nationals priority on jobs and benefits, and limiting Europe's rules on cross-border travel. She claims Macron embodies an elitism that has failed ordinary people.
In the face of this cold oligarchy who grab power, in the face of a self-proclaimed arrogant and moralistic elite, we are the voice and the soul of the silent majority. The overly kind silent majority, a majority that I am calling on to lend their voice by lending me their votes.
A surprise Le Pen win, similar to events such as Brexit and the election of Donald Trump as US president, is still possible. On the streets of Paris, uncertainty hangs in the air.
I really don't want Marine Le Pen to be in power. I think she's totally pro-Putin, and I totally oppose her foreign policy. I also oppose the atmosphere of civil war that she risks putting in place, especially with a hint of racism that has remained despite her efforts at softening her image.
In the northern city of Arras, concerns over the far right have faded.
Before, I was for Mr. Macron. My ideas corresponded with his, and like many people, I'm disappointed by his mandate, and I want to give a chance to Marine Le Pen. I really support her, with my heart. I studied her background, and she has improved a lot since 2017, when she last ran for president.
4 recent surveys published after Wednesday's tense TV debate showed Macron's score as either stable or rising slightly. But they also put the voter turnout rate at between 72% and 74%, potentially the lowest for a presidential runoff since 1969.
And now to tell us about what lies ahead for France, we are now being joined by 2 special guests, both from Paris. Ben Page, the Global Chief Executive of Ipsos, and Marlo Enthinger, an independent journalist and the author of a new book on the election called Zemmour and Gaullism. I welcome both of you to WION World is One.
Thank you. All right.
Right, Marlo, I want to start off this discussion with you. You've written extensively on this election, the tight race, which is quite clear to all of us, to say the least. Both the candidates are campaigning fiercely as of now. Before we discuss their manifestos, what's the feeling on ground? What are your predictions about the next president of France?
If I had to choose someone, it would be Macron right now.
I was down in Avignon recently for Marine Le Pen's rally, and then I was in Marseille for Macron's. And I'd say both of them weren't really having a ton of enthusiasm. Neither of them, the attendance wasn't packed for either of them. And I don't really feel that energy for Le Pen. Of course, that's just, tea leaves almost. But there doesn't seem to have been a real breakthrough. And that was sort of confirmed by the debate the other night, which nobody seemed very impressed by Marine Le Pen's performance, similar to 2017, where a lot of people weren't, and it failed to pay off.
Right, Marlo, I want to ask a follow-up to that because this is quite surprising. It is a big election and you're saying that there's very less enthusiasm at their respective rallies. Before I get Ben's take on this, why do you think is the French voter disinterested in both the candidates?
Obviously they were the candidates who got the most votes, but there's a whole, group of French voters who are completely uninterested in these two candidates. The third place finisher, a guy named Jean-Luc Mélenchon, a radical left candidate, came within 400,000 votes of making it into the second round. And about 2/3 of the voters say they're not even going to vote. Only a third say they'll vote for Macron. So there's a whole third political force in the country which is sort of excluded from this second round right now. And, I just don't think everyone feels they have a stake because this is just a rerun of 2017 for a lot of people.
Right, that's a powerful statement right there. You're saying not everyone feels they have a stake. Ben, I want to take your take on this. What can be said about Macron's popularity in particular? We saw the election debate. It was very civilized, to say the least. And yet Macron has been warned to not be complacent. Tell us your perspective.
Well, I mean, he's obviously ahead in the polls, and it will be a bigger upset than the Brexit vote in 2016 or Trump's victory in America in 2016 if Mrs. Le Pen was to win. But it's fair to say that Mr. Macron is winning not because he's the most popular candidate, but perhaps because he's the least unpopular candidate. And as we've already seen, there's a lot of people who are not interested or not impressed with any of the candidates that have come through to the final round. So the French are fed up. They're among the most pessimistic people in Europe. They believe that the country does not necessarily have better days ahead of it. And this loss of the future is what this campaign in some ways is about. But, it's the least worst candidate that is now being chosen.
Another powerful statement, the least worst candidate that may be chosen. Coming back to you, Marlo, I'm going to quote some of the stuff that you've written. You have said that Macron claimed that France was missing a king figure, then spent 5 years ruling it like a monarch. You've also called Marine Le Pen xenophobic. Tell us about the same. Yeah,
that's part of this discuss with Macron. He's really governed within the logic of the Fifth Republic. The Fifth Republic was established by Charles de Gaulle, and it gives a lot of power to the presidency. In 2017, he got a huge legislative majority, which allowed him to basically govern how he wanted. The only pushback was on the streets, and you saw that a lot during the Yellow Vests movement, the only sort of thing that put a brake on any of his ambitions. Le Pen is a xenophobe and a racist, and she's tried to tone down that image. Her party, the National Rally, used to be known as the National Front, and it was founded by her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, and a former SS officer. And they sort of came to power running on this grievance against immigration. This election cycle, they had another opponent, a guy named Eric Zemmour, who I wrote this book about. We sort of filled the space that Le Pen used to fill. He said these things outright. He said the French people are being replaced by immigration. Explicitly, he said that. And right. Le Pen could occupy this place where she even seemed a little more moderate. And at the speech in Avignon, she barely mentioned immigration at all. Though, of course, I went out for a walk the next day, and there's posters right outside of the city saying, "Stop immigration, vote Le Pen." So that element is there. It's just she's tried to emphasize it less and pitch this social program, because there's a lot of anger against Macron's social policies like pension reform and the retirement age.
Right. Now that we've spoken about the two candidates, let's talk about the geopolitical game at this point. Ben, I want to take the next question from you. The election comes at a significant time, to say the least. Let's talk about geopolitics now. The Russia-Ukraine war, the position of France in the European Union, the French economy, as of course the pandemic, which is still looming large in the backdrop. What will be the deciding factor for the French voter?
Well, I mean, the French are not quite as anti-Russia as the British and Americans, but they're certainly uncomfortable about what is happening in Ukraine. And of course, Mrs. Le Pen borrowing money from a Russian bank and some of her previous statements about Putin and Crimea undoubtedly haven't helped her in the campaign. And in fact, during the debate, of course, which the immediate snap polls afterwards give 6 out of 10 of the people watching it felt that Macron won, compared to only 4 out of 10 thinking Mrs. Le Pen won. The war, you know, the war is a deciding factor. But over all of that is economics, the cost of living, inflation, and that is, of course, how Marine Le Pen, with her listening to the common man, promising that nobody under 30 will pay taxes, nobody over 60 will have to work, they can just retire. That has really caught on, this left moving on the economy at a time when people are seeing rising inflation in France and already felt the future was not what they had originally been promised.
Right. Marlo, I want to take the same question for you. What is it currently that the French voter will be voting for? What is it that he or she wants from their next president?
In terms of geopolitics, yeah, like Ben mentioned, I believe when the war started in Ukraine, I won't get the exact number of the poll, but there was a sort of split in a poll that came out in who they believed was responsible. But at the same time, you know, I've traveled around the country a bit, and there's Ukrainian flags everywhere in every city, and at the cash registers, appeals to raise funds for them. So I think that probably does bear a lot on what people think. The candidate I was very interested in, Eric Zemmour, he was polling at 16% at one point before the war started. And he had made statements about Putin in the past, saying, you know, France needs its own Vladimir Putin. I think you can attribute a lot of his decline to something like that, which tells me that is important to people. Le Pen, of course, has close links to Putin. She is in her campaign material, she used to pose shaking his hand. Like Ben mentioned, there was the loan that she took, which was the subject of the debate. She says she's been paying it off, that she took it because she couldn't get any French banks to take a loan. But, you know, that comes up. I think she's really leaned into this sort of multipolar idea of foreign policy. And that's a really common idea on the French far right, that there's an alternative to the Atlantic global order led by America. At her speech in Avignon, she even mentioned adding new countries to the UN Security Council to acknowledge this changed world. India, actually, she mentioned adding, and then maybe an African country on a rotating basis.
Right. All right, Marlo and Ben, thank you so much for all those insights. We at WION will, of course, to continue to track all the updates coming in as the world watches about who will be the next French president. Thanks for joining us. WION World is One is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.